Hello again. Here's video 2 of presidential roles. These will be the last 3 that we cover. Again, one is sort of a ceremonial role, and the other 2 are more official roles. And keep in mind that different presidents, I didn't really talk about this in the first one, are going to embrace different things. When you think about Obama, you think about Trump, they were much more domestic oriented, whereas someone like Nixon was a good example of someone who was more foreign policy oriented, just what they were into or what the situation dictating. George W. Bush becomes the war president because 9/11, etc., and Bill Clinton was not, for instance, except for a small part, and Obama the same way, which is, sometimes plays to their strengths, sometimes doesn't. So anyway, first is leader of the free world. Now, when you think about the free world, roughly Western Europe, Japan, South Korea, Israel, parts of South America, I suppose, Canada, so on. But basically, is the president leader of the free world? Not officially, no, but when it depends on the president, depends on the times, but normally if there's trouble somewhere, we are looked to, and what we say, what we do, definitely has an impact on what the rest of the world does. Whether it's stuff like refugees from war, whether it's stuff like wars, obviously World War I, World War II. We sort of come in later, take over, dictate policy, and then set the rules for afterwards. In both, especially after World War II, obviously. But it's sort of that whole, if you've ever heard of NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the United Nations, and all this kind of things. We are, to varying degrees, playing a big part in this. NATO, more or less, designed to control the Russians, which still sort of is that, the UN, to make sure that people behave and so on, even though it doesn't always work. But like I said, this becomes, as the U.S. withdraws some, like under Obama and to some degree under Trump, it's not as big a deal as it was during the Gulf War. When you had, I forget how many, but we had a bunch of countries that all signed up to varying degrees to help fix this problem of Iraq and the problem of Afghanistan and so on. Secondly, you have chief diplomat, and this can be a big thing or not a big thing, depending, but it's almost always something. You got relations with other countries. And it's not just about war. We had good relations with the British and the somewhat the Russians and etc. during World War II, and then they get rocky afterwards and go back and forth and so on and so forth. But think about things like treaties, which aren't that common. But it's not just about just treaties like peace treaties, but think about trade here. So I'll add economic to that. This part of it's about massaging egos. Part of it's about diplomacy. Doesn't have to mean being nice. Diplomacy can also mean, hey, here's the deal. You're going to build this wall and you're going to pay for it. That kind of stuff versus, hey, how about we work together and so on and so forth. There are different strategies. There's no one right way, I suppose. But think about agreements, think about treaties from a cultural perspective, military alliances and things like that. NATO is an example. This goes together somewhat. Political, the UN, economic things like I forget what it's called now. The one with Canada and the United States and Mexico, and then there's one in the Far East where you got these trade partnerships and about tariffs. That's still diplomacy, or not tariffs, quotas, immigration. All those things go in here, and it takes a certain skill set, frankly, to do well at this. Sometimes it's through strength, sometimes it's through, talk, whatever. Usually it's kind of a combination of both. But think about this, and even down to stuff like fun stuff, like you guys that went to Germany and went to visit the kids, and then they came and stayed with us. Exchange students, things like that, would not be possible without a good, agreement between those countries. You're never going to see, a North Korean high school student come here for obvious reasons. As much as they might benefit from it, we're never going to have that arrangement, at least under the current situation. So that kind of stuff makes things nicer. Even cultural exchanges where I don't know, I had a kid, 2 kids once from Ireland who stayed with me for a few days when they were visiting. They were like this traveling orchestra, and they were on this goodwill tour, and just little things like that, make you sort of, you get along and you trade and you don't fight as much. And in theory, cultural exchanges can be very helpful and makes life a little nicer and so on and so forth. So anyway, chief diplomat. And then finally we have the chief legislator, which the president doesn't actually legislate except for executive orders, which I'm going to make my own video about that. But here you're talking about introducing legislation, actually physically introduce, not physically introducing, but being in charge of writing it, if you will. That could be a budget. That could be this stimulus thing right now we got going with the throwing the $15 minimum wage in, and then you get into fighting for it or against it if it's the other party or whatever. But fighting for, how hard do you fight for it? How hard do you if Biden says I want that $1,400 check, but the minimum wage I'll be willing to do without if we get the check, because that's more important immediately, or is the minimum wage or environmental protections or whatever further down the road. And maybe if we pass the one part now, we can pass the other part later, versus trying to jam it all down the Republicans' throats, which has merit, but it also has risk. So you get into how hard do I fight? How personally do I fight? When you're talking about, President Biden's not going to go down to the Capitol himself and testify, but he might send his chief blah blah blah, or the chairman of this, or the secretary of whatever, and that sends a clear signal. Or have them come over. Hey Pelosi, hey Schumer, hey Cocaine Mitch, hey McCarthy, come on to the White House and let's talk about this. Like with Biden doing having the Republicans come over, I told you about, for lunch, and talking about their proposal, which he ultimately rejected, but at least he had them in. That's, kind of diplomacy in legislation, if you will. So think about how these things sort of go together. And then the actual lobbying, whether lobbying means in Congress or, and some of you history guys might know this phrase, often associated with Theodore Roosevelt. It's called the bully pulpit. For Trump, it was Twitter. For Reagan, it was going on TV and talking to the nation, kind of going above the heads of Congress, because he's the only person still that can be like, I need to be on TV tonight. And like, okay, no problem. And he goes on and addresses, we are attacking the Iraqis tonight, and here's why. We need a minimum wage increase, and here's why. We need a tax cut, and here's why. And again, whether it's Twitter, going on news shows, sending your guys out onto news shows, creating spin and all this, which we've already talked about, that is probably the main way that presidents try to legislate. There's both. There's the outsider method, if you remember, talked about interest groups. Hey, America, call your congressman, call your senator, and tell them to vote for this or whatever. But also doing the grunt work inside and getting those votes and talking to the whips and talking to the chairman and doing that work what is necessary. A lot of presidents don't like doing that because it's not glamorous. Trump was not good at it, frankly. But he had this, like it or not, in a major league way. So, sometimes both, sometimes, LBJ right there, man. You bully people, frankly, into voting for stuff. And, dude got Vietnam and Great Society, the whole welfare package, passed more or less the same time, which is miraculous. That wouldn't happen today, no way. In that context with the divisions that we have and so on. So anyway, chief legislator is a pretty big deal. And like I said, executive order is the other part on your sheet there. Will be something I cover in a separate video. So, all right. So those are your roles. Any questions, just let me know. Otherwise, see you.